The chamber was silent except for the hum of energy fields that kept 47 different species alive in the same space. Ambassador Richard Torres stood alone in the center of the vast room, his hands clasped behind his back. Above him, the council sat in their designated zones. The crystalline vacs glowed with inner light. The gaseous thought forms swirled in their containment fields. The insectoid larvae clicked their mandibles in anticipation. Richard had known this day would come. For months, humanity had felt the cold shoulder of galactic politics. Trade agreements were suddenly renegotiated. Military cooperation exercises were canceled without explanation. Human diplomats found themselves excluded from important discussions. Now he understood why the High Arbiter, a towering being made of living metal, spoke in a voice that translated directly into Richard's mind. The charges were read aloud for all to hear. Humanity stood accused of dangerous unpredictability. They had modified their own genetics without council approval. They had developed artificial intelligence beyond the permitted levels. Worst of all, they had been conducting secret experiments with dimensional physics, a field strictly controlled by galactic law. Richard tried to defend his species. He explained that humans were curious by nature, that exploration and innovation were written into their very DNA. He argued that every discovery humanity made was shared freely with the galactic community. He pointed out that human medicine had saved millions of alien lives, that human engineering had improved ship designs across a dozen species. The council was unmoved. One by one, the representatives spoke. They called humans reckless. They said humanity moved too fast, changed too quickly, and took too many risks. The VAX representative showed holographic images of human genetic laboratories. The HFY displayed records of AI research facilities on Mars. The thought forms revealed surveillance data of the dimensional physics lab hidden in the asteroid belt near Jupiter. Richard felt his heart sink. They had been watching everything. Every secret project, every classified experiment, every attempt humanity made to catch up with species that had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. The council had seen it all and judged it threatening. The verdict came swiftly. Humanity was to be banished to the outer veil, a region of space on the far edge of the galaxy. It was a place the council considered worthless, filled with radiation storms, gravitational anomalies, and dead systems with no useful resources. All human colonies in council space must be evacuated within one solar cycle. All trade would cease immediately. All communication channels would be blocked. Humanity would be cut off completely. Richard wanted to argue, to plead, to make them understand. But the energy field around him activated, signaling that his time to speak had ended. He was escorted from the chamber by silent guard drones, his footsteps echoing in the massive corridor outside. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks through the council jump gates. Richard spent the time preparing his report, trying to find words that would make this catastrophe sound less terrible. He failed. When his ship entered Earth's orbit, he looked down at the blue and white planet and wondered if future generations would curse his name for not doing more. President Elena Ortiz met him at the landing platform in Geneva. She was a small woman with steel in her eyes and a presence that filled any room she entered. Richard delivered his report in private, his voice barely above a whisper. When he finished, Elena sat in silence for a long moment. Then she surprised him. Instead of despair or anger, she smiled. It was not a happy smile, but one of grim determination. She told Richard to rest, that she would handle the public announcement. He tried to protest, to say it was his responsibility, but she waved him away. She had a plan, she said. Trust her. That evening, President Ortiz addressed the entire planet. Billions watched on screens in their homes, in public squares, in offices and schools. She told them everything. The charges, the trial, the verdict, the exile. Richard watched from his apartment, waiting for the panic to begin, but Elena did not stop there. She spoke of opportunity instead of punishment. She reminded humanity of their history, of how they had been exiled, oppressed and dismissed before, yet always survived and thrived. She talked about the outer veil not as a prison but as a frontier. An entire region of space that would belong to humanity alone, where they could build, experiment, and grow without council oversight or restrictions. Her words were fire. She called for volunteers, for the brave and the bold, for those who wanted to write the next chapter of human history. She promised that no one would be forced to leave Earth, but those who chose to go would be remembered as pioneers. The greatest exodus in human history would begin immediately. Richard watched in amazement, as the panic he expected never came. Instead, there was determination. Anger at the council, yes, but also excitement. Within hours, millions had signed up for the colony ships. Within days, the number reached billions. Humanity had been challenged. And humanity was responding the only way it knew how, by moving forward. The solar cycle passed in a blur of activity. Every ship that could be spared was converted for long-range travel. Entire cities were packed into cargo holds. Resources were gathered, stockpiled, and loaded with military efficiency. The human colonies in council space were evacuated, their populations joining the great fleet assembling beyond Earth's moon. Richard found himself assigned to the lead ship, the New Horizon, serving as senior diplomatic advisor. Not that there would be any diplomacy where they were going, but Elena insisted. Old habits, she said with that same grim smile. The day of departure arrived. 12 billion people across thousands of ships prepared to leave the only part of the galaxy they had ever known. Richard stood on the bridge of the New Horizon as the countdown began. Around him, crew members worked with quiet efficiency. Outside the viewports, the fleet stretched as far as he could see, the engines engaged. The fleet began to move. Earth fell away behind them, growing smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light among billions. The journey to the outer veil would take months, even with the fastest human drives running at maximum as they crossed the boundary into the restricted zone. The ship's long-range scanner suddenly went wild. The science officer called out in confusion. Richard moved to look at the display and felt his breath catch in his throat. There were structures out there. Massive structures orbiting dead stars and drifting between systems. They were old, older than anything the Galactic Council had ever found. Ancient stations and facilities that should not exist in this supposedly worthless region of space. And as the human fleet passed the first of these structures, it began to glow. Lights that had been dark for millions of years suddenly activated. Energy readings spiked across the spectrum. The structure was responding to their presence. President Ortiz appeared on the command channel from her ship. Her expression was unreadable. She gave one simple order that Richard knew would change everything: investigate. Humanity had been banished to the edge of the galaxy, but they had found something the Council never expected. Something that had been waiting in the darkness. For someone to finally arrive, the exile had just become an opportunity. 50 years had passed since the Great Exodus. Commander Marcus Webb stood at the observation window of New Terra's orbital defense station, watching construction drones work on the latest expansion. The station had grown from a simple outpost to a fortress that rivaled anything the Galactic Council possessed. But unlike Council stations, this one incorporated technology that should not exist. Marcus was 45 years old. Born during the journey to the outer veil, he had never seen Earth except in recordings. New Terra was his home, a planet that had been terraformed in record time using techniques adapted from the ancient structures humanity had discovered. The planet's surface now held cities of 20 million people, and more arrived every year from the inner colonies. His communicator chimed. It was Dr. Yuki Tanaka calling from the planet threshold, 3 systems away. Her voice carried barely controlled excitement. They had found something, she said. Something intact. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. In 50 years, humanity had discovered hundreds of ancient ruins, but most were damaged beyond repair or only partially functional. An intact facility would be unprecedented. Marcus took the next available transport to Threshold. The journey through the Void Drive network took 6 hours, a trip that would have taken weeks with Council jumpgate technology. The Void Drives were humanity's first major breakthrough, reverse-engineered from the ancient structures. They did not bend space like Council drives. Instead, They somehow moved ships through a parallel dimension where distance meant something different. Threshold was a cold world orbiting a dying, red star. It had been named for its position at the edge of explored space. The research facility was built into the side of a mountain, and Marcus could see the ancient structure even from orbit. It was a perfect sphere half buried in rock, 2 kilometers in diameter, made of a material that seemed to shift colors in the light. Dr. Tanaka met him at the entrance. She was a small woman in her 60s, with gray hair and eyes that sparkled with intellectual hunger. She had been part of the original science team that investigated the first structure 50 years ago. Since then, she had dedicated her life to understanding the predecessors. As humanity called the ancient builders, the entrance had been sealed. She explained as they walked, but her team had finally found the activation mechanism. It required a human to place their hand on a specific panel and think a specific pattern. Council species had tried for centuries to open such doors and failed. Only humans could do it. Inside, the facility was pristine. Lights activated as they walked, responding to their presence. The walls were covered in symbols that shifted and changed, as if the structure itself was trying to communicate. Marcus followed Dr. Tanaka through corridors that seemed to go on forever. Though the structure should not have been large enough to contain them all, they reached the central chamber, and Marcus stopped breathing. The room was circular, perhaps 100 meters across, with a domed ceiling that showed the stars outside despite being deep underground. In the center floated a holographic display that activated when they entered. It showed the galaxy, but not as humanity knew it. This map included regions marked in red, vast areas that spread like infection across the spiral arms. Dr. Tanaka touched the display and it zoomed in. The red areas were labeled in a language that translated directly into Marcus's mind. Void zones, they were called. Places where reality itself had been damaged. The display showed how these zones had grown over millions of years, consuming entire sectors. Then it showed something else, massive entities moving through the void zones, creatures that seemed to be made of broken space itself. A recording began to play. It showed the predecessors, beings that looked surprisingly similar to humans but taller and with luminescent skin. They spoke and their words translated automatically. They told of their civilization's golden age, of art and science beyond imagination, of expansion across the galaxy. Then they told of their mistake. They had developed technology that drew power from the space between dimensions. It was infinite energy, perfect and clean. But using it created tiny cracks in reality. At first, the cracks were harmless, sealing themselves naturally. But as the civilization grew and more of the technology was used, the cracks began to connect. And through those cracks, something came through. The devourers, the predecessors called them, entities from a universe of entropy and decay, drawn to the energy of ordered reality like moths to flame. They consumed not just matter, but the very structure of space-time. Wherever they went, reality broke down. Stars collapsed into nothing. Planets simply ceased to exist. Entire sectors became void zones where physics no longer functioned consistently. The predecessors fought back. They developed weapons, sealed some of the larger rifts, and pushed the devourers back. But they could not win. There were too many rifts, and the devourers multiplied by consuming reality itself. In desperation, the predecessors enacted a final plan. They seeded genetic material across the galaxy in primitive species, hiding fragments of their own DNA in creatures that might one day evolve. They built facilities that would only activate for beings with that specific genetic pattern. They left behind all their knowledge, all their technology, and all their warnings. Then they gathered at the galaxy's core and sacrificed themselves to create a massive barrier that would hold the devourers at bay. But the barrier was temporary. The recording said it would last perhaps 10 million years. After that, the devourers would return. The predecessors hoped that by then, one of the seeded species would have evolved, found the facilities, learned the truth, and finished the work of sealing the rifts permanently. The recording ended. Marcus and Dr. Tanaka stood in silence. Finally, Marcus spoke. Humanity had been chosen, he said quietly. Not by accident, but by design? They were not just explorers or survivors. They were the heirs to an ancient civilization and the last hope against an existential threat. Dr. Tanaka nodded. But there was more, she said. The recording had included data files, detailed schematics for technology beyond anything humanity had yet discovered. Gravity manipulation, faster-than-light communication without relays, weapons that could damage the fabric of space itself, and something else, warnings about what not to do. The Galactic Council's quantum entanglement drives. The recording warned, created tiny rifts similar to those that brought the Devourers in the first place. They were too small to allow the entities through now, but they were weakening the barrier. The more the Council expanded, the more they used their drives. The faster the barrier degraded. Marcus asked the obvious question. How much time did they have? Dr. Tanaka pulled up another display. Based on current rates of Council expansion, the barrier would fail in less than 200 years. Maybe less if the Council discovered new colonies or trade routes that required more drives. Marcus returned to New Terra, with his mind racing. This information needed to reach the highest levels of government immediately. President Jacob Cole, Elena Ortiz's successor, convened an emergency session of the Colonial Council. Representatives from every human world gathered in a secure chamber deep beneath New Terra's capital. The debate lasted for days. Governor Patricia Valdez of the Colony Redemption argued for isolation. Humanity should focus on building their own empire, she said, and let the Council face the consequences of their technology. They had banished humanity after all? They deserved whatever came. General Thomas Briggs disagreed. He wanted to weaponize the predecessor technology immediately. Build an armada that could protect human space when the Devourers returned. The Council would be overrun first, he argued, but eventually the entities would reach human territory. Better to be ready. Engineer James Newton led a third faction. He wanted to study the technology carefully before making any decisions. Humanity needed to understand not just how the predecessor devices worked, but why humans could activate them when other species could not. There might be other surprises waiting in the genetic code the predecessors had left behind. Before any decision could be made, something else happened. A probe emerged from deep space, traveling faster than anything humanity had built. It was damaged, barely holding together, but it transmitted a message before its power failed completely. The message was in the predecessor language, but it translated easily. 3 words repeated over and over: they are watching. Then a longer message: they are waiting. They chose you. The probe's hull was analyzed and found to be made of the same material as the predecessor facilities. But it was newer, perhaps only a few thousand years old. Marcus examined the probe's final transmission. It had recorded something before failing, an image from deep space. At first it looked like nothing, just darkness between stars. But when the science team enhanced the image, they saw something that made everyone in the room go silent. There was something massive out there, moving slowly through the void. It was not a ship or a station or even a devourer. It was something else entirely, something so large that it took several seconds to cross the probe's field of view. The shape was impossible to describe, geometry that hurt to look at. And it was heading toward known space. President Cole made the decision. Humanity would prepare, he said. They would study the technology, build weapons, and fortify their worlds. But they would also watch and wait. Revealing themselves to the Council was not yet an option. Humanity would build their empire in secret and hope they had enough time to be ready when the ancient enemy finally returned. 20 years had passed since. The discovery on threshold. Admiral Rebecca Cole sat in the command chair of the flagship Defiant, watching the viewscreen show empty space. Except it was not empty. Around her ship, invisible to normal sensors, floated 200 vessels of the Shadow Fleet. They were humanity's answer to the coming darkness. Ships that incorporated the most advanced predecessor technology yet discovered. The Defiant itself was a marvel. 3 kilometers long, it could phase partially out of normal space, becoming undetectable to any known sensor system. Its weapons could tear holes in reality itself, though such weapons were used sparingly and only in testing. The crew of 5,000 had trained for years in combat, scenarios against threats that most species could not even imagine. Captain Lucas Grant stood at the tactical station, monitoring the fleet's position. He was Admiral Cole's second in command and had been with her since the Shadow Fleet's creation 15 years ago. Together, they had overseen the construction of an armada that the Galactic Council did not know existed. An empire built in the darkness between stars. Humanity now controlled 200 worlds in the outer veil, each one connected by void drive networks that made communication instantaneous and travel a matter of hours instead of weeks. The population had grown to 30 billion souls, all living in colonies that blended human architecture with predecessor technology in ways that created something entirely new. But humanity's greatest achievement was remaining hidden. Intelligence Officer Maya Reeves had built a network of listening posts and stealth satellites that monitored every council communication within 1,000 light years. From her command center on New Terra, she could watch the council's every move without them knowing humanity still existed. The reports she sent to Admiral Cole were both encouraging and disturbing. The Galactic Council believed humanity had scattered after the exile. Some council species thought humans had died out in the harsh conditions of the outer veil. Others believed humanity had reverted to primitive survival, barely clinging to life on a handful of worlds. A few council historians even wrote papers about humanity as a cautionary tale about species that advanced too quickly. The truth would have terrified them. Humanity had not just survived, but thrived. They had built cities inside asteroids and stations that hung in the void between stars. They had mastered gravity manipulation and created artificial environments that surpassed anything in council space. They had weapons that could destroy planets and defenses that could withstand the fury of a star, and they had been watching. Every council trade route, every military movement, every scientific expedition. Humanity saw it all. They watched council mining ships enter what the aliens thought was abandoned human territory. They observed council scientists examining the ruins of human colonies, taking samples and writing reports about the failed species that once lived there. Some council races had even begun claiming former human worlds as their own. The Frafka established mining operations on 3 planets humanity had evacuated. The Vax built a research station on a moon where a human city had once stood. They had no idea they were being monitored every second, that humanity could have destroyed them at any moment but chose not to. This was Maya's doing. She argued constantly against revealing humanity's presence. Every year, President Cole asked if it was time to make contact. Every year, Maya said no. Let the council remain ignorant, she argued. Let them think humanity was gone. The longer they believed that, the more time humanity had to prepare for what was coming, because it was coming. Scientist David Park had made a breakthrough that changed everything. Working with data from a dozen predecessor facilities, he had reconstructed the timeline of the ancient civilization's fall. The Devourers were not just random entities. They were symptoms of something worse, a fundamental breakdown in the structure of reality itself. The barrier the predecessors created at the galaxy's core was failing faster than predicted. David's calculations showed the Council's quantum entanglement drives were accelerating the decay. Every jump gate they built, every ship they launched, every expansion into new territory created more micro-rifts. Like cracks in glass, they were spreading and connecting. David estimated they had perhaps 50 years before the barrier failed completely. Maybe less if the Council continued expanding at current rates. And when it failed, the Devourers would return not in small numbers but as a flood. They would consume everything in their path, and the Galactic Council had no weapons that could stop them. Humanity faced an impossible choice. Reveal themselves and warn the Council, possibly saving trillions of lives but exposing human territories to Council aggression. Or remain hidden and hope humanity alone could stand against the coming storm. President Cole called for another emergency session, and the debate that had raged for 20 years resumed with new urgency. Before a decision could be reached, the choice was taken from them. A Council exploration fleet, searching for new resources, stumbled into human territory. They appeared at the edge of the redemption system, 6 ships running full sensor sweeps. They detected the human colonies immediately. Captain William Drake commanded the defense station above redemption. He watched the Council ships on his screen and felt his heart sink. Years of secrecy about to end because of one random encounter. He opened a channel to the Council fleet. Speaking in their trade language for the first time in 70 years, the Council captain was Hravka, and the shock in his voice was obvious. Humans? Here? Impossible. The Council had declared humanity extinct or scattered. How could there be colonies? How could there be stations using technology the sensors could not fully analyze? William tried to explain, tried to tell them to leave peacefully, tried to avoid what was about to happen. But the Hravka captain was afraid. He saw weapons on the human station that he did not recognize. He saw ships in orbit that moved in ways that should not be possible. He saw an empire where there should have been nothing. Fear made him stupid. The Hravka captain ordered his ships to fire, to destroy the station before it could threaten them. It was the worst mistake he ever made. William's station had shields that bent space itself around the structure. The Council weapons passed through layers of folded reality and dissipated harmlessly. William returned fire, not with energy weapons but with gravity lances. 3 of the Council ships simply collapsed, crushed by their own mass as localized gravity fields increased 10,000-fold. The other 3 tried to run, tried to jump away to safety. 2 made it. The third was caught by a void mine that tore a hole in space and pulled the ship through into somewhere else. The 2 surviving ships jumped back to Council territory carrying news that would shake the galaxy. Humanity was not dead. Humanity was powerful. Humanity had technology that made Council weapons look like toys. And humanity had been hiding in the outer veil for 70 years, building and watching and waiting, but the Council ships never delivered their message. As they entered Council space, reality itself seemed to tear open around them. Great wounds in space appeared, bleeding darkness that consumed light. Through the wounds came things that should not exist. Beings made of broken geometry and entropy, the Devourers had arrived, drawn by the massive energy discharge of the battle at redemption. They were early, decades before David's predictions. They fell upon the Council ships like predators on wounded prey, unmaking them atom by atom. Then they moved toward the nearest Council world. Leaving tears in space behind them, Admiral Cole received the reports and made an immediate decision. The Shadow Fleet would engage. Humanity could not hide anymore, and they could not let the Council face this threat alone. She gave the order, and 200 ships phased back into normal space for the first time in years. President Cole made a broadcast that went out on every Council channel, bypassing security with technology the Council did not know existed. His face appeared on screens across 1,000 worlds. He spoke in the galactic trade language, and his words were simple. Humanity had been exiled, he said, but humanity had survived. They had found the truth about the predecessors and the Devourers. They had technology that could fight the entities. And despite everything the Council had done, humanity was willing to help. Not as servants or subordinates, but as equals. The choice was the Council's, but even as he spoke, a faction of Council hardliners led by Marshal Kren of the Hravka made their own choice. If humanity was powerful enough to threaten them, then humanity must be destroyed. The Devourers could wait. Marshal Kren launched a coordinated strike on human colonies. Hitting a dozen worlds simultaneously, Admiral Cole watched her screen light up with distress signals. Redemption was under attack. New Terra's outer colonies were burning. Millions of humans were dying while the real threat consumed Council worlds nearby. She felt rage like she had never known, cold and terrible. The Council had learned nothing. They were making the same mistakes that doomed the predecessors. She gave the order she had hoped never to give. The Shadow Fleet would split. Half would engage the Devourers. The other half would end the Council threat permanently. The war that humanity had spent 70 years avoiding had finally begun, and it would reshape the galaxy forever. The attack on human colonies had been devastating but not unexpected. General Amanda Cross stood in the command center beneath New Terra, coordinating the defense of 12 worlds simultaneously. The Council strike had been well planned, hitting military targets and infrastructure with precision. But Marshal Kren had made one critical error. He assumed human defenses would be similar to Council standards. They were not. Every human world had been fortified over 70 years with predecessor technology. Shields that bent space, weapons that manipulated gravity, automated defense systems that responded faster than any living pilot. The Council forces broke against these defenses like waves against stone. Within 6 hours, the attack had been repulsed with heavy Council losses, but the damage was done. 3 million humans were dead. Colonies burned. Families destroyed. Amanda felt the weight of every loss as she prepared the counterstrike. This was not about conquest, she told her officers. This was about ensuring the Council could never threaten humanity again. While they dealt with the real enemy, the Shadow Fleet's second wave emerged from void drives across Council space. They did not target civilian centers or populated worlds. Instead, Amanda's forces systematically destroyed every Council military installation within 500 light years. Shipyards were reduced to debris. Fleet bases simply ceased to exist. Weapon platforms were torn apart by gravity weapons. It was not a battle. It was a demonstration. Humanity could have destroyed the Council any time in the past 70 years. They could have taken revenge for the exile, for the humiliation, for being cast out of galactic society. They had chosen mercy instead. That mercy had been repaid with betrayal. Admiral Cole's half of the fleet engaged the Devourers near a Council world called Vertex Prime. The planet held 2 billion Vax, crystalline beings who lived in massive geometric cities. The Devourers had already consumed 3 cities before the human fleet arrived. Reality itself was breaking down, leaving void zones where physics became unreliable. The Defiant led the charge. Captain Lucas stood at his station, watching as their weapons fired. These were not normal weapons. They were reality anchors, devices that stabilized space-time and prevented the spread of void zones. Where they struck, the tiers in space began to seal. The Devourers, sensing resistance, turned their attention from the planet to the fleet. What followed was like nothing in the history of warfare. The Devourers were not ships or creatures in any normal sense. They were animate gaps in reality, absences that consumed everything around them. Council weapons passed through them harmlessly because there was nothing physical to hit. But predecessor weapons worked differently. Human ships fired gravity lances that crushed the space around the Devourers, containing them. Reality anchors sealed the rifts from which they emerged. Phase cannons struck them in multiple dimensions simultaneously, overwhelming their ability to shift through broken space. For the first time in millions of years, the Devourers were being pushed back. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it ended, Vertex Prime was saved. The void zones were sealed. The Devourers were driven back through the rifts, which humanity's engineers then collapsed. 2 billion Vax had watched humans save their world from a threat they did not even understand. The recordings spread across the Council networks within hours. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. The chamber was in chaos. Half the representatives demanded immediate alliance with humanity. They had seen the power of human technology, seen how humans could fight beings that consumed reality itself. Pride no longer mattered when existence itself was at stake. The other half, led by surviving hardliners, argued for continued resistance. Humanity was too dangerous, they said. Today they saved Vax worlds, tomorrow they might conquer them. Better to die free than live under human domination. Marshal Kren, his fleet in ruins, spoke of honor and independence even as Devourer attacks increased across Council space. Counselor Myra of the Peaceful, Luminar species tried to mediate. She proposed a joint investigation into the predecessor facilities, shared research into the Devourer threat, and equal partnership in whatever solution was found. Her words were drowned out by argument. The Council was fracturing. Then scientist Victor Reynolds appeared before the Council. He was humanity's leading expert on predecessor biology and had spent decades studying the genetic legacy left in human DNA. What he revealed silenced every argument. Humans were not random. They were not simply a species that happened to find ancient ruins. They were the predecessors' chosen heirs, deliberately created to finish the work of sealing the rifts. Victor showed genetic evidence that humanity shared key DNA sequences with the predecessors. These sequences were not natural evolution. They had been carefully inserted into early human ancestors millions of years ago. The sequences included genetic triggers that allowed human nervous systems to interface with predecessor technology in ways other species could not. More than that, Victor revealed something the Council found difficult to accept. The predecessors had examined hundreds of species across the galaxy before choosing humanity's ancestors. They had looked for specific traits: adaptability, creativity, persistence, and the ability to work together despite differences. They had found those traits in early humans and decided that species, more than any other, had the potential to grow into what the galaxy needed. The council chamber erupted. Some species felt insulted that they had not been chosen. Others felt relief that humanity bore this burden instead of them. A few felt hope that perhaps the predecessors had known what they were doing. But the hardliners simply refused to believe it. They called it a human lie, a story invented to justify their power. Marshal Kren stood and called for a vote. The council must choose, he said. Surrender to human dominance or fight for their freedom. It was a vote that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Before it could be taken, the chamber's alarms began to scream. Devourer signatures were appearing everywhere. Not the small incursions humanity had fought at Vertex Prime, but massive rifts opening across a dozen sectors simultaneously. It was as if the barrier at the galaxy's core had suddenly failed completely. Thousands of void zones appeared, and through them came horrors that dwarfed anything seen before, and the Sire Council fleets vanished in seconds. Planets were consumed. Stars went dark as the Devourers fed on reality itself. The Council Chamber's viewscreen showed system after system falling into chaos. Reality was unraveling faster than anyone had predicted. Admiral Cole received reports from across human space. The Devourers were hitting Council territory first, but they would reach human colonies within days. The Shadow Fleet was already overstretched, trying to seal rifts and evacuate Council worlds. They needed help, and they needed it immediately. President Cole made the decision. Humanity would share the technology. Not weapons, not ships, but the basic principles of reality anchors and gravity manipulation. Any Council species willing to fight would receive technical specifications and human advisors. They would become partners in defending reality itself. The data transmission went out on every channel. Within hours, Council engineers were studying human designs. Within days, the first Council-built reality anchors were being tested. They were crude compared to human models, but they worked. The Council had hope for the first time since the attacks began, but it was not enough. The Devourers were too numerous, the rifts spreading too fast. David Park calculated that, at current rates, half the galaxy would be consumed within a year. They needed a solution, and they needed it quickly. Then Maya Reeves found something in the old predecessor archives. A location marked with symbols that translated as The Last Stand. It was at the galaxy's core, hidden within the barrier the predecessors had created. A megastructure of impossible size, a facility that combined aspects of weapon, prison and seal, the Void Nexus the predecessors had called it. It was their final creation, built in the last days before their civilization fell. It was designed to permanently seal the rifts between dimensions, to end the Devourer threat forever. But it had never been activated. The predecessors had died before they could complete the final step. Victor studied the data and discovered why. Activating the Nexus required a permanent connection, a consciousness that would merge with the structure and become its guardian forever. Someone had to sacrifice not just their life, but their very self, becoming something between human and machine, between individual and system. They would exist forever at the boundary between dimensions. Maintaining the seal against the DVOURERs. President Cole received the report in silence. Then he made an announcement that shocked humanity. He would be the sacrifice. As president, as the leader who had guided humanity through the darkest times, it was his duty to ensure their future. Admiral Cole argued, General Cross protested, but he was unmoved. An expedition was prepared. The best ships, the best crew. A journey into the galaxy's core where gravity became a weapon and radiation could kill in seconds. They would reach the Void Nexus, activate it, and save the galaxy. It was humanity's purpose, the reason the predecessors had created them. President Cole would fulfill that purpose or die trying. The Shadow Fleet assembled for one final mission. Behind them, the galaxy burned. Ahead lay the unknown. And somewhere in the darkness, the Devourers waited. Hungry for the end of all things, the journey to the galaxy's core took 3 weeks through void drives, pushed beyond safe limits. Admiral Cole commanded the expedition fleet from the Defiant, 50 ships carrying the best humanity had to offer. President Cole traveled on the flagship, spending his final days reviewing reports and recording messages for the people he would leave behind. Engineer Sophie Martinez led the technical team that would activate the Nexus. She was brilliant, uncompromising, and absolutely terrified of what they would find. The predecessor archives had been vague about the Nexus's exact specifications. They knew it existed, knew what it was supposed to do, but the details were unclear. They were flying into the unknown with the fate of the galaxy. Resting on their success, the galactic core was beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Stars packed so densely that night became meaningless. Black holes warped space into impossible geometries, radiation levels that would kill unshielded crew in seconds. The fleet navigated carefully, using predecessor technology to shield themselves from the worst effects. They found the Nexus exactly where the archive said it would be, hidden within a massive nebula that shimmered with colors that should not exist. The structure was beyond anything humanity had built. A sphere 10,000 kilometers in diameter, covered in patterns that hurt to look at directly, floating in space as if gravity meant nothing. Sophie's team detected power readings that should have been impossible. The Nexus was still active after millions of years, drawing energy from the fabric of space itself. Docking ports opened as the fleet approached, as if the structure recognized them. As if it had been waiting, the interior was vast beyond comprehension. Corridors that seemed to stretch forever. Ambers that existed in more than 3 dimensions. Technology that Sophie could barely understand even with all her training. And at the center, a throne room where reality itself seemed thin and fragile. President Cole entered the chamber with Sophie and Admiral Cole at his sides. The throne was not furniture, but a living part of the structure, covered in neural interfaces and dimensional anchors. Holographic displays activated, showing the galaxy in real time. Red zones marked where Devourers had broken through. The red was spreading like infection. A recorded message played. The last predecessor, a being who looked remarkably human, explained the final step. The Guardian would merge with the Nexus, their consciousness expanding to encompass the entire structure. They would exist at every point of the barrier simultaneously, feeling every rift, every attempted breach. They would have the power to seal dimensional tiers and drive back the Devourers, but they would never be human again. They would never sleep, never rest, never end. An eternity of vigilance. President Cole stepped toward the throne. Admiral Cole grabbed his arm. There had to be another way, she said. They could study the Nexus, find an alternative, build automated systems. He could not sacrifice himself like this. Before President Cole could respond, someone else moved. Daniel Foster, a pilot from the Colony of Redemption, walked past them toward the throne. He was young, barely 30, with scars from the Devourer attack that had killed his family. He had volunteered for the expedition specifically for this moment. Daniel spoke quietly but firmly. He had seen what the Devourers did. He had watched his home burn, watched people he loved unmade by broken reality. President Cole had a galaxy to lead through reconstruction. Humanity needed him. But Daniel had nothing left except the chance to make sure no one else lost what he had lost. President Cole tried to stop him, tried to order him away. Daniel ignored him. He sat on the throne and the interfaces activated immediately. Neural connections pierced his skull, not painfully but inevitably. His eyes went wide as his consciousness began to expand. Sophie's instruments went wild. Energy readings spiked across every spectrum. The Nexus was waking fully for the first time in millions of years. And Daniel was at its heart, his mind spreading through the structure like roots through soil. They watched as he changed. His body remained on the throne but seemed to become part of it, flesh merging with technology in ways that blurred the line between living and machine. His eyes glowed with light that was not quite light. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere, and nowhere Daniel could feel everything. Every rift in the barrier, every devourer trying to break through, every dimensional weakness across the entire galaxy. It was overwhelming, infinite, impossible. But he held on. He thought of his family, of his home, of all the lives that depended on him. And he began to work. The Nexus responded to his will. Reality anchors built into the structure's core activated on a galactic scale. Rifts that had been spreading began to seal. Void zones started to collapse. The Devourers, sensing their access being cut off, fought back viciously. Daniel felt their attacks like physical blows, but the Nexus shields held. Admiral Cole watched on the Defiance screens. As red zones across the galaxy began turning, blue, sealed, protected, safe, the barrier was not just being repaired but reinforced, made stronger than it had ever been. Daniel was doing what the predecessors could not. He was ending the threat permanently, but the cost was visible in the throne room. Daniel's expression showed the strain of containing galactic-scale consciousness in something that had once been human. Sophie's readings indicated his original personality was fragmenting, being absorbed into the Nexus's systems. Soon there would be only the Guardian, and Daniel Foster would be a memory. President Cole stood before the throne and spoke. He thanked Daniel for his sacrifice, promised that humanity would remember, swore that this gift would not be wasted. Daniel's glowing eyes focused on him for a moment, and something human flickered there. Then it was gone, replaced by something vaster and more distant. The expedition returned to human space carrying news that spread like wildfire. The barrier was sealed. The Devourers were contained. The galaxy was safe because one human had given everything to make it so. Daniel Foster became a legend overnight, a name spoken with reverence across 1,000 species, but there was still work to do. The Galactic Council was shattered. Marshal Kren's faction had been discredited by their attacks during the crisis. Half the Council species had lost worlds to the Devourers before the barrier was sealed. The old order was gone, and something new had to take its place. General Amanda Cross led negotiations with surprising diplomatic skill. She proposed a new federation, one where species joined as equals rather than subordinates. No one race would dominate. Decisions would be made by consensus. And humanity, despite their technological advantage, would be first among equals rather than rulers. Not everyone agreed immediately. Some species remained suspicious of human power. Others wanted humanity to lead, to use their predecessor technology to impose order. But Amanda was patient. She pointed out that humanity had spent 70 years building an empire in secret and had chosen not to conquer anyone. They had shared their technology freely during the crisis. They had sacrificed one of their own to save everyone. Slowly, carefully, the new federation took shape. Former council species joined alongside human colonies. Trade routes reopened, this time with human void drive technology that made travel faster and safer than council jump gates had ever been. Cultural exchange programs began. For the first time in galactic history, humans and aliens worked together as true partners. It was not perfect. There were disputes over territory, arguments about technology sharing, species that refused to join and maintained their independence. But it was better than what came before. It was built on sacrifice and cooperation rather than fear and hierarchy. 10 years after the activation of the Nexus, Ambassador Richard Torres stood at a memorial on New Terra. He was old now, his hair white, his face lined with decades of service. The memorial was simple, a black wall with names carved in light. Daniel Foster's name was at the top, but below it were thousands more. Humans and aliens who had died in the Devourer crisis, in the battles. In the attacks, a young Vax approached him, her crystalline body refracting light in beautiful patterns. She was a student at New Terra's University, studying human history. She asked Richard if the sacrifice had been worth it. If losing so much, suffering so much, had truly been necessary. Richard looked up at the stars. Human ships patrolled alongside Vax cruisers and luminar science vessels. Former enemies working together? The Outer Veil, once a prison, had become the center of a new galactic civilization. Humanity had been banished because the Council feared what they might become. They had become what the galaxy needed. Richard smiled at the young Vax. Yes, he said quietly. It was worth it. Every loss, every sacrifice, every moment of fear and uncertainty. Because they had not just survived. They had transformed exile into opportunity, isolation into strength, and fear into hope. Humanity had been chosen by the predecessors for a reason. They had proven themselves worthy of that choice. The student thanked him and left. Richard remained at the memorial, one hand resting on the cool surface where Daniel's name glowed. In his mind, he remembered the scared young man who had stood before the Galactic Council 70 years ago. He remembered President Elena Ortiz's speech about frontier and opportunity. He remembered every step of the journey that brought them here, and somewhere, at the galaxy's core, Daniel Foster's consciousness maintained eternal watch. He could feel Richard's thoughts through connections that transcended space. The loneliness was vast, the burden heavy, but he did not regret his choice. He had seen what the Devourers were. He had felt the rifts trying to tear reality apart, and he held them back, day after day, year after year. Sometimes he perceived things beyond the barriers, entities and forces that made the Devourers look small. The universe was larger and stranger than anyone imagined. There were threats out there that would one day test the galaxy again. But when that day came, humanity and their allies would face it together. The new Federation was imperfect, young, sometimes chaotic. But it was alive with possibility. Species that had barely spoken now collaborated on projects that would reshape the galaxy. The predecessor technology was being studied, improved, and adapted in ways the ancient civilization never imagined. Art, music, literature, and science flowed freely across 1,000 worlds. Richard left the memorial as the sun set over New Terra's capital. The city spread before him, a mix of human architecture and alien design that somehow worked together perfectly. Children played in parks, human and alien side by side. Above, the stars were coming out, each one a reminder of how far humanity had come. They had been banished to die. Instead, they had built an empire. Not through conquest, but through persistence. Not through domination, but through sacrifice. Humanity had been tested by exile, by isolation, by threats that could end reality itself. And they had passed every test. The greatest mystery remained. Why had the predecessors chosen humanity? What had they seen in early humans that made them suitable heirs? Victor's genetic studies could not fully answer that question. Perhaps it was adaptability. Perhaps it was the human tendency to find hope in darkness. Perhaps it was simply that humans, more than any other species, refused to give up. Whatever the reason, the choice had been made millions of years ago, and humanity had proven worthy of it. The galaxy had a future now, one built on the foundation of sacrifice and cooperation. The Devourers were contained. The rifts were sealed. And at the heart of it all, one human consciousness stood eternal watch, making sure the darkness would never return. The exile had ended. The empire had risen. And humanity's true journey was only beginning.